Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now for today what we're going to do is go back to one of the very earliest videos I think I did for the channel. And we're going to paint men and women of the Astra Militarum. I think since the time I first did that video there's been 2 or 3 editions of 40k come out and a whole bunch of new paints, which we'll talk about as we go through this. Now what I'm showing you here is the end result past a little bit of extra work. I'm going to stop about halfway through the video and show you what I would call a finished guardsman, and certainly something that you can put on the table and play games with, sort of a battle ready, if you will. And then we're going to carry on and take it further. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, along with the method I've used to do the base here. Let's get started. So, do you remember this guy? This fella here was the Cadian sergeant that I painted. He is from one of the very first videos that I did on the channel, and honestly a lot of the lessons from him are still relevant now. Obviously the miniatures will have changed, but the way in which he's painted will work perfectly well for the new miniatures too. Now ordinarily I'd recommend, go watch that video, but man it's old. So we're updating not just the method, but the video. But I am going to bring this fella back on screen a few times just to refer to some of the old ways, if you will, and show how they'll still work with your new toys. And so, here is one of those new toys. Now this fella, I've done exactly the same as the old guy and primed him with a spray of Xandri dust. It's going to be the basis for most of what we do. Now even if you have primed and you've got it into most of the areas, you'll see I haven't really missed anywhere, it's good practice still to grab a little bit of Xandri dust from the pot, and just with a damp brush, give this a quick once over, jam it into any recesses that you might have missed with your primer. Now this isn't strictly necessary, but it's good practice, and it will help if you have missed anywhere. Now once that's dried, what we're going to start off with is a dry brush to introduce a little bit of texture and some depth to the miniature. Now some folks are going to give you all sorts of advice on how to avoid a chalky texture with your dry brushing, but in this instance, it's actually exactly what we want. What I have here is Tyrant's Skull. You'll see I'm working it into what is actually a little makeup brush. A small dry brush or something similar from Citadel will work perfectly well, but I don't want very much in my brush at all. I'm going to then dry brush the edge of my base to get a feel for what I'm going to leave behind, and then catching the edges of the detail very carefully at first. Yeah, that'll do. That's about right. What I'm going to do is go all around the uniform and just use this to pick out any raised creases or folds, edges in the sleeves and what have you. And going over the same area a few times, you'll see we slowly build up that color, and that's pretty much what we want. So what I'm going to do is, well, the whole uniform, I'm not terribly concerned if I hit things like his equipment or his weapon or what have you. We're going to paint that later. And you will need to go back to your brush, so you paint rather occasionally to pick up some fresh stuff. But in your own time, dry brush your soldier, away you go. Now with that done, we get a bit of depth, and interestingly enough, we've also got a guide for where we can highlight later on if we want to. What we'll move on to now is some Abaddon Black, and we're going to paint him from the lowest level up. Now the idea here is that every layer we're applying is one that we're using to tidy up our last work. And this is really the first stage where we can go a little bit wrong. So what I'm going to do is start with the little black neck piece that these guys have nowadays. To be perfectly honest, I think you could get away with just leaving this in your Xandri dust. I don't know quite why somebody would wear a black undershirt with this sort of uniform, but that's not for me to decide. Take your time around this one. All you're trying to avoid is the collar. So start from the bottom of the little neck piece and then move your brush up, because if you hit the face or the helmet, it won't matter. And then the only other black details I'm going to worry about are going to be his boots, and those are nice and easy to reach. Okay, black boots and neck piece. Let's put them aside for a second, because I want to talk about browns. Now this little dollop I've got lurking here, this is Steel Legion Drab, and we're going to use this to paint 2 things. First of all, his gaiters, and any of the straps that are holding on his armor plates, like around his arms. Now, on the official miniatures, I'm pretty certain that they've used the same color as his webbing, which is normally Rhinox hide, to paint those straps. But because I want to cut down on the amount of time I have to spend going backwards and forwards, I'm going to paint them the same brown. Now, when it comes to putting water into your paint, some folks will fill it and make a big mess. So what I'm doing here is just getting a little bit of water on my brush, put it down next to my paint, and then slowly start mixing it in. And it gives me much more control over what sort of consistency I've got, rather than just getting a great big dollop of water and throwing it on the top and then going, oh, my paint's not come out the right way. Slow down. Then rinse your brush off, and you can load up your brush from the paint on your palette, and you've got much more control this way over where it goes. So, like I mentioned, let's get in on the straps around his arms. And these are a little difficult to get to in some places, so don't feel bad if you skip them in some places. And the gaiters, at least, are right there. Now, particularly on the gaiters, you may find that needs a second coat to get you a nice solid color, but make sure you're letting it dry thoroughly before applying that second. Now we need to talk about green, because if you want to use the old method, then that uses Castellan green for the armor. And, well, there's the end result when we're all finished with it. But the Warhammer TV team recommend using Vulcan green as the basis for the new Cadian armor, which is a fraction lighter. And I kind of like it. I do like that lighter finish, so I'm going to try and mimic that. But I don't have Vulcan green. So what I'm going to use instead here is a Vallejo color. This is US dark green, and it is more or less identical to Vulcan green. It's not going to matter too much once it's shaded. The main differences between the green that I'm using and good old Castellan green is that this is a fraction lighter and not quite as saturated, which is quite nice actually. So you'll see this covers very well over the armor, and this, at least to my mind, is a good reason. If you can get your hands on Vallejo paints, some of them are going to be extremely useful for what we're going to do with our Cadians. Sometimes I'll recommend Vallejo because it's what I've got in front of me, and sometimes it's just the coverage is so much better that, yeah, it's worth trying to find them if you can. So what I'm going to do is cruise around all of his armor, carefully paint this in, just avoiding areas that his fatigues are. Stuff like his webbing on the front of his chest here, for example, don't worry about it, we can still hit that and tidy up as we paint more. Wait a second, hold the phone. There's something very important I forgot. That's his skin. Because his helmet is going to sit over the top of his face, it's going to be much easier if we base coat all of his skin now before we do the green. So, whoops. What I've got, this is Blood Reaver flesh. This fella's got quite a broad nose, so I'm thinking he's probably not Cadian flesh tone. But any skin tone that you want to use, you can apply this now before putting the green on. See, look at this. I've been doing this for years and I still mess up my steps sometimes, so don't worry if you're not getting it perfect first time either. Okay, now let's get in and paint the green. Now, previously, if you look at the old Cadians, all of their armor and equipment, so their weaponry, was painted in the same shade of green. But if you look at the guys on the new box, their lasguns appear to be a little bit darker than their armor is. So what I've got here, this is Nocturne Green, and I've used my original green first of all, just to show you, yeah, that's what the whole thing would look like. But I'm going to put on this Nocturne Green instead, because this is quite a dark green, similar to, Caliban Green, but without being quite so saturated, and I really like how it looks. I do quite like that. I did also notice on the box that parts of the lasgun were going to be black later. Whoops, so trying to save time earlier, turns out I missed something. Now the pack on his back here, I'm going to use Morghast Bone, but it doesn't appear as though there is actually a single color that they use. Some of them are grey, some of them are beige, so Carrick Stone or Administratum Grey, something like that will work here just as well. And now, finally, we can start getting into the webbing. Now, like I mentioned, sometimes there's a reason I will suggest a Vallejo color over Citadel one, and this time it's definitely because of the coverage. What I've got here, this is German Camo Black Brown, which is quite a mouthful. And it is almost identical to Rhinox Hide. It's maybe just a little less red. But you'll see it covers absolutely beautifully. So what I'm going to do is take my time here. Just try and avoid any of the little greebles that are on the packs. Some guys are going to have ropes or spare lasgun packs, that sort of stuff. Just paint around them as carefully as you can. Now that's a bit where it is worth slimming down a little. You will find you actually save yourself time by taking your time rather than having to come back and fix things all the time. One more time. So now we'll start painting in the metallics, and I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel. And you'll notice I've got a fairly chunky brush here. This is one of the synthetic brushes from Warlord games. For certain areas, especially on lasguns, I quite like using a synthetic brush because I can be a little bit rougher with it and not feel so bad about destroying the point. But as well as this, of course, we've got the grenades to paint in silver. Any of the metallic bits really at this stage. And remember as well that you can swap between brushes as you need to. So I'm definitely going to get a smaller brush to paint in the dots on his collar. Now, the last of the base coats that we're going to apply is some Corax White. Now, some folks have a bit of trouble with this because it can be a little finicky. What I suggest is the first time you open the pot, pop a little bit of Lamian Medium in there and an agitator of some description. And that'll help you when you have to mix it up each time you want to use it. So let's apply a little bit of that there on the Aquila. And I'm going to paint in his tea mug with this too. At this stage, any other little details, like if there's ropes or any other bits and pieces which your guardsman is hanging on to. Alright, once you've done all of your base coats, go around and do any little bits of tidy up that you need to. Even on the jacket, you can just hit it with a little bit of Xandri dust and it'll be fine. Let's pop him aside though, because I want to talk about what we're going to do next, which is to shade him. Now this fellow on the right, he was shaded using neat Agrax Earthshade. Now, of course, it was the old Agrax Earthshade because that was what was available at the time, but the color is going to be much the same. So that's something to bear in mind. It's quite dark, but I still quite like the finish. We are going to shade this dude just a little bit differently. What I've got here is a good reason to not throw out your empty pots. This is a half and half mix of Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium. It doesn't matter if it's the old or the new stuff because the medium is going to quite significantly change the flow properties. It's going to behave like the old stuff no matter which one you're using. So give it a good shake, and then what we'll do is apply this generously over the entire miniature. Grab yourself a big old brush and make sure that you're working it into any recesses. Standard procedure for a shade, really. If you get any big pooling areas like on the top of his helmet, just guide it around so that you don't have big brown blobs in strange places. And once you finish with this, pop him somewhere to dry, and then we'll leave him for about half an hour. Come back and see what he looks like once that's done. So there's our dry Cadian, and then, side by side, that's the difference between thinned and unthinned Agrax Earthshade as well, which is actually super useful even for me to see. Yeah man, thin that stuff, that works really well. Anyhow, from here, that's more or less a painted guardsman. So what I'm going to do is actually pop a base on him and apply his decals real quick before I do any highlighting or stuff like that, because if painting for an army, you guys don't have to be perfect. This is finished as far as an army needs. So let's get a look at what a finished guardsman looks like, and then we'll take it a little further. And there, with those couple of extra details done, is a finished guardsman. Now you put down this fella with 60 of his mates and he's going to look great. But of course we can take it further. There's something I actually really like about this particular method is you can finish an army, and then once you've won a couple of games, you decide you want to come back and make it look a little nicer. Well, that's easy. Now, the easiest place to start when it comes to fixing up a miniature is by highlighting his skin. So what I've got is Night Questor Flesh, and I'm going to use my small layer brush for most of this from now on. What we'll do is start by just dotting in the back of his knuckles. That's always nice and easy. When it comes to his face, concentrate on stuff like, let's get him in shot there, his nose, His cheekbones. And yeah, there's not much you normally have to do on guard when they've got the chin straps on, because it does make them a little bit hard to reach. You'll see I've covered over most of his face with that, and left just the shaded areas and the recesses. What I've got now is I've mixed in about half and half. This is Cadian flesh tone and that Night Questor. Now I'm just going to do a couple of little lines on his cheekbones across the top of his lip. Now the next most prominent part to highlight is going to be his armor. Now you can use Lauren Forest for this, but I tend to like using Strachan Green because it's a little bit lighter and it dries a little bit more greyish when it is dry. You don't have to highlight every edge and corner, but top edges and any leading edges, like on the bottom of the shoulder pads for example, are a good candidate for this. Then for his jacket and trousers, we'll use a little bit of his Shabti bone. Now the same principle applies here. You don't necessarily have to highlight every crease and fold. Just pick the areas where you want the sharpest, most prominent creases. And you'll see the dry brush has already given us a pretty good guide for where some of those should be. And here's the fun part. For that really dark green we used on the rifle, whatever green you used on the armor, the base color, so in this case this is that US dark green, you can just do a quick splash of this across the top with the edge of your brush. We're starting to get into the realm of diminishing returns here. There comes a point when you're just highlighting Guardsman for the sake of it. But let's do some Gorthal brown on some of the areas of the leather. Remember to gently tap your camera before you do it. A tiny wee touch of white scar just to brighten up those white details that we've got. So the skull, and I'll flip him around and I'll paint his mug with this as well. And if you're going to go to the trouble of painting an enamel mug, well, Calgar blue ends up in everybody's toolbox at some point anyway. So a little line of that around the rim, because why not? And then finally, because at this stage, why not? A little bit of Stormhost silver, just to brighten up the corners of the metallic details. And finally, if you did want to, then you could use Baneblade brown on the gaiters. That one I'm not going to though, because I draw the line at highlighting gaiters. But from here, what I'm going to do is take him outside. I'm going to hit him with a matte varnish. You could hit him with Munitorum varnish, which is a sort of satin. It's a semi-matte. But honestly, matte tends to photograph better, so I'm gonna hit it with a matte varnish. Let's get a look at this fella once he is all done. And there at last, our Guardsman is complete. And I hope this goes some way to show that there is a point at which you can stop painting an Imperial Guardsman, but then if you are enjoying yourself, you can carry on. I think once you've done about 30 of these guys, your standards are probably going to slip a little and you might want to do it the quick way, but for the sake of completion, and if you are more patient than I am, maybe you want to do the whole job on all of your Guardsmen and have them looking like this. That will be a stunning army, I think. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.